My name is Nick Tucker. I'm Culture and Performance Lead at WeAreUnity. I'm a psychologist by trade, and I've worked with over 100 organisations that are all going through some version of transformation. So today I've got the next 20 minutes or so to talk to you about the age of the avocado leader and how we can turn crisis into catalyst. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about three things. One, I'm going to use an analogy of an avocado to talk about an emerging trend in leadership research. Two, I'm going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 and some of the research that we're doing with a leading academic institution. And then number three, I'm going to leave you with a gift. But first, let me give you a little bit of context. So we know that now, more than ever, shareholders are losing patience, and this is really impacting the top. Australia's CEO turnover rate is the highest in the world at 21.9%. And we know customers have a greater sway. 63% of people prefer to buy from an organisation that is purpose-driven. And organisations like Nike are cognizant of this and are able to thrive in this new environment. You know, interesting point, their purpose is around unleashing human potential, and the way they measure that, the number one measure is community impact, and that's the annual investments as a percentage of their pre-tax income. So you think about that, it's pretty forward thinking of the past. And we know that the ivory towers of the past are being dismantled by social media, royal commissions, and glass.com.au reviews, because we know that technology increases transparency. And with transparency, we know that people have the opportunity to have a voice, and they're starting to impact it. And this is one of my favourite Glassdoor reviews, toxic work environment. Most people are walking around thinking they're going to be fired next. The leadership is the poor, to say the least. Communication is non-existent. The pressure is on employees is ridiculous, extremely high turnover. But good news is, at least they have nice co-workers and free snacks, which is an upside. But we also are starting to see the onus, and really a lot of organisations struggle. And this is a business that's been in the news a lot lately in Australia. AMP is kind of a financial institution that a lot of individuals in Australia and New Zealand have their retirement funds invested in, and culturally there's been some toxic goings on. And what we're starting to see is a real shift in societal expectations about what is culturally acceptable and what isn't. You know, gone are the days of mad men, and good riddance to that, but a lot of organisations are struggling to keep up. And in the shadow of the Royal Commission, what we have found is that a lot of businesses are experiencing this balancing act. So how do you regain public trust while also satisfying shareholder expectations? And nobody wants to be called by Mr. Kenneth Hayne again. And let's be honest, it's rotten. And sorry to put a picture of a rotten avocado on your screens, but we know that a lot of what's going on isn't really working. And what we are doing isn't working very well either. If I put a simple Google search around soft skills in leadership development, I get 646 million hits. Gurus are selling the power of empathy. They're selling the power of authenticity and adaptive leadership to help us solve these woes. And in theory, this is great. But in practice, this is an unrealistic expectation for our leaders. And what we need to start to do is shift on, because there is a conflict in traditional leadership theory where the majority of executives are actually incentivized by growth, they're incentivized by revenue and other hard business metrics, not their level of empathy or self-awareness. Okay, so I've been leading you on. This idea is a bit firm, it's a little bit green, but the logic stands. The future of leadership requires balance. So enter the avocado leader. So the avocado leader is a term that we defined through some research we were doing this year. And this is a leader who has a soft, empathetic exterior balanced with a harder, commercially focused core. Let me tell you a story. Case study. Global technology company. The executive team was struggling to make decisions and consequently were putting the performance of the entire network at risk. They were in a situation where they were moving away or they were unable to kind of function and make a decision. And essentially it was like driving a car when they were all heading over a cliff. And we kind of thought, why? Why is this an issue? You know, this is straight out of the engineering textbook. Think a global technology company. All these executives were straight out of the engineering textbook. They were smart. they were pragmatic, they were experienced, they were technical. But like most organizations where technical experience was highly valued, it turns out that this focus had created an interesting cultural nuance. And it was not okay to be wrong, let alone have your colleagues challenge you, God forbid. And this created a sense of fear that paralyzed them. And business critical decisions were being made in isolation. And it wasn't until a serious performance issue played out that this risk was brought to light and we started to address some of these issues. And this brought to the fore this concept of psychological safety, which a lot of you will be really familiar with. And I'll define it as the cultural conditions that allow people to openly challenge, take risks, and be vulnerable. Because what we need to do as we start to build and lean into this new era of avocado leadership is we need a bridge between the hard and the soft. And that creates an environment where we can focus on the softer side of psychological safety, safe to speak up, but it's all through the lens of the harder stuff of how do we use this to innovate? How do we use this to self-disrupt so that we can drive value for our business, for our colleagues, and ultimately our shareholders? And this is where we got to. So there are a lot of self-awareness and a few challenging conversations with this leadership team. And what we got them to do was sign up to a set of simple, observable behaviours to improve their output. And ultimately, we put in accountability measures to guarantee that sustained behaviour change. So here's a few ideas that we use with them to balance the hard with the soft. So explicitly ask your colleagues to challenge you. You think about the way that you set up a business case, the way that you build a plan, build a strategy. How often do you explicitly ask your colleagues to challenge you? Or how often do your leaders think about your C-suite employees? How often do they explicitly encourage people to challenge them? And this is really an idea of, okay, how would our competitors sell against us? How would we break this theory or this strategy that I've got? And what we would also lead on is this idea of how do we seek conflicting opinions? In a lot of organizations, we see groupthink, we see people going down the route of, well, how do I have a conversation or with someone who's going to confirm my bias? And this is really the idea of who is that person that is difficult, that is going to challenge you, and how do you get in a room and start to work out how you can co-create something better? The third one, which I've alluded to, is we've got to acknowledge that everyone, even you, even me, has an unconscious bias. And the final point is how do we encourage the most senior person in the room to speak last? How many meetings have you been in where people are deferring to the most senior individual in the room to see what they think so that they can validate their opinion or make sure that they're going the path of least resistance? And this is a nice transition into the second point that I wanted to talk to you about. And this is some research that we've done with Macquarie Business School. So for context, Macquarie Business School is one of Australia's leading academic institutions. We're partnering there with Associate Professor Denise Jepson and also Dr. Sarah Bankins. And over the last couple of years, we've done two research studies over the past 2 years, and we've spoken or interacted with 277 organisations that employ over 800 Australians. So this gives us a nice, solid data set for us to start to understand. And our first research study was really one around, well, how do we understand what progressive people and culture looks like? So when I say progressive, let me define that for you. Progressive organisations are those who outperform the competition by delivering people and culture strategies that drive a distinct competitive advantage to business performance. So this was pre-COVID. I'm going to talk post-COVID in a minute. And then what we found is that these progressive organisations were significantly outperforming the market. So they were 33% more likely to deliver superior stock market performance, 5 times more likely to create superior pace of innovation, 2 times more likely to drive growth, 2 times more likely to deliver superior service quality. So these became the benchmark of, well, who do we want to learn from? Who do we want to aspire to be? And how do we start to learn what are some of the mixing points that we delivered? And interestingly, when we wrote the report, this is page 3 of the original report, we released this in February, so, right before the train wreck happened. And we started it off with this theme around how do you future-proof your business strategy? And we had this term in here around the 2020s becoming the decade of radical reinvention. And far out, I wish that we had known what was coming down the pipe. I wish that we knew and could have claimed that we had done this. But what we have really seen is a really radical reinvention very quickly. And that's when, as we all know and we'll all talk about today, COVID hit us. And our research question shifted. So we went away from, okay, what does best practice look like? What does progressive organisations look like? And we moved towards, well, how can we understand and sustain the benefits of COVID? A lot of the clients we were talking to were telling us that actually, unless they were a travel insurer or a major airline, a lot of businesses were seeing actually increases of performance, increases of productivity, and some of those really harder business outcomes. The softer mental health, well, I probably wouldn't call it soft. The mental health aspects is a key risk that I'm going to call out. But we wanted to say, well, how do we start to get some of the things that we want to sustain and really understand the factors that have driven that? And what we found, first and foremost, and this will be no surprise, is that agility has been the key to survival. So 87% of leaders and executives that we spoke to believed that their organisation was agile in responding to COVID-19. A lot of businesses threw everything out the window. They accelerated transformation. They accelerated flexible ways of working, and they really focused on what needed to get done to ensure that their business would survive through this very, very challenging period. And we started to see the performance impacts as well. I'm going to put a few up here. We saw 63% of organisations saw improved innovation, 56 reported improved productivity, and 32% reported improved psychological safety. And from an innovation point of view, a great example was an organisation that we were working with had an 18-month IT roadmap. Like most businesses, a roadmap that spanned over more than a year. And they delivered that roadmap in 7 days. 18 months to 7 days in terms of innovation and productivity and how fast this organisation was moving. Another trend that we saw around psychological safety was actually a shift in the psychological contract. So in the past, organisations were getting away with doing things that they wouldn't have gotten away with. So, for example, in Australia, a lot of the Big Four consulting firms cut pay. These are factors that would have, or actually a lot of organisations cut pay, but these are the factors that would have been met with revolt in the past, that people just said, you know what, let's survive together. But what it created was this theme around, well, how do we challenge, how do we speak up, how do we take risks, how do we remove some of the bureaucracy? And that brings me back to my avocado analogy. And one final part, well, actually it's not the final one, but the recipe for the Avocado Leader in COVID-19. And what we found is that there was a distinct capabilities from the hard to the soft. So even though we knew there was no playbook for dealing with COVID-19, our research really highlighted that the pandemic increased the speed and confidence in decision-making through the knowledge that any decision is better than no decision. We saw this huge increase in decisiveness. Leaders we spoke to said that the crisis forced them to think fast and act fast as a result. And the pace of the pandemic quickly and visibly separated the good from the bad when it came to the quality of decision-making. We saw that at the highest level, and we also saw at the middle manager level that there was an increase of empowerment, increase of trust, and a real focus on how we can keep the business moving. And probably the best example of a large insurer that I was working through the period, they went from 60 strategic projects, which sounds like a bit of an oxymoron, 60 strategic projects, down to 10. That decisiveness, that focus, that really making sure that we are focusing on the things that matter to keep our business moving forward. And then there was the soft, the empathy, the blurred lines between the home and office, the fact that you can now in my living room. What you don't know is that I have 2 children and my house is an absolute wreck. But thankfully, my daughter has set up 15 soft toys so that I have an audience to present to right now. The second bit is around the empathy, is we saw that empathy as a skill development is really coming to the fore. And we saw leaders trying to demonstrate care and starting to show support for their teams and well-being, and this well-being factor. Because as we saw the performance increase, we saw the mental health risk jump up as well. And for me, that's really around, well, how do we transition our focus away from just hard performance outcomes more to sustainable performance, which is more where this avocado comes in. And a connectedness point of view, we are now more connected than ever. And we've seen internal networking, coaching sessions, cultural team morale building activities over the internet. Our research suggests that employees are saying that they are more connected to the human that they employ than they ever have before. And it leads us to an interesting question, and I think it's something that a lot of us on this call or presentation will be thinking about, which is, well, how do we truly sustain some of those factors? And what we're seeing is leading organisations are now capturing the behaviours observed during COVID-19 and building them back into their values. So they're taking integrity, respect, and trust off the wall, and they're looking at, well, how do we reset the behavioural framework that we want to operate? How do we reset those things that really matter to us, that are going to help us deliver not only a great experience for our employees, but also great results for our customers and shareholders? One example here would be an organisation that implemented the 80-20 rule. So we've been talking about this. It's a little bit around how do we focus on the 80% that matters and just remove the 20% that doesn't? How do we remove those decisions? How do we remove that bureaucracy and just get on with it as a key outcome of this COVID experience that we've all been going through? And then the final point is around how do we grow avocado leaders? And in case you're wondering, that is actually what an avocado tree looks like. I had no idea that that's what it looked like, but that is what an avocado tree looks like. Okay, 3-step process I'm going to walk you through in terms of how do we grow avocado leaders. So step number 1, we need to reset expectations. So we need to balance the hard commercial acumen, financial driven outcome focus with the soft, the empathy, emotional intelligence, the connectedness to really deliver that psychological safety. As a result, we need all our development initiatives and performance processes to be clearly linked, the individual leader behaviour to the desired commercial outcome. So if you think about that, what are the leadership capabilities that we need to drive sales? What are the leadership capabilities we need to innovate and create new products to drive PD? And how do we encourage our leaders to create an environment that helps employees share their ideas, disrupt, challenge, but never do this at the expense of business priorities? This isn't about everybody being right. This is about everyone having a chance to contribute and share their opinion. And the art here is to skillfully ask for challenge. And then if you disagree, to disagree through the framework of a business rationale, which is really, really important. And yes, we need to reset expectations about what is required for our leaders to deliver on strategy, but we also need to hold leaders to account, which I'll touch on a little bit later. Now, the second bit is how do we build capability to manage the hard with the soft? So we need to develop our leaders by focusing on business outcomes, as I've discussed, but also think about what is the business case for investing time in soft skills? How do we move this away from the fluffy land into how do we use these capabilities to drive business performance? And that's where data analytics becomes so important in terms of understanding the impact of leaders on the employee experience, to then look at what impact does that experience have on their ability to serve customers or drive value, whatever that looks like. And those leaders, we know, once we know what those things are that drive value through the chain, how do we prioritize them? How do we develop them? How do we invest in those so that we're generating a real quantifiable ROI, as opposed to throwing out motherhood statements around empathy, authenticity, emotional intelligence? It's looking at what works within that business, and then how do we use that to drive value and ultimately create an environment where the best idea wins, the best solution wins. And then the final one, which I touched on, is around how do you hold leaders to account? So we've seen in the last couple of years that there is a greater appetite for transparency and accountability. Some Australian organisations have even hired a psychologist to give feedback on meetings around the way they're interacting with each other so that we can be open and transparent. And we know that transparency drives performance because it gives leaders an understanding of what behaviours they need to prioritise over the rest. If we can get this prioritisation right, then that is a competitive advantage. And the key for any organisation is to stick with it, because nothing will change if you're not prepared to hold leaders to account for being leaders. So when it comes to avocado leadership, how do you grow avocado leaders? Number 1, reset expectations. Number 2, build capability to manage the hard with the soft by drawing a clear link between leadership behaviour and performance. And then number 3, ultimately hold those leaders accountable for being leaders in the same way that you'd hold them accountable for driving performance. All right. So I promised you a gift at the beginning. So I want to leave you with one last thought, because as we go with the avocado analogy, a theme kind of jumps into your head, and that is, well, what do I do with rotten avocados? Everyone's got leaders in their business. Everyone knows somebody or has worked for somebody or has a friend who worked for someone who is a rotten avocado. How do we deal with this? And my solution for you today is to turn them into yummy chocolate brownies. Because I didn't know this, but overripe avocados make very, very yummy brownies. I'm going to leave this recipe here for you guys so that you can take advantage of that. But it really speaks to this idea around the future requires balance. If we're too soft, we're never going to get executive level buy-in or investment. If we're too hard, we'll never build cultures that support psychological safety, growth, and innovation. So thank you all for your time today. I think I'm just about on the number, maybe a few minutes for questions, Al. But thank you all, and stay safe.
Hey, Nick, that was fantastic. I'm still dealing with the avocado brownies. I'm having my, cognitive dissonance and excitement at the same time. So thank you for that. Yeah, I do want to pick up on one theme that you touched on, and it's this notion of a behavioral framework, because there's great work in IO psychology over the years. I mean, power of habit, happiness advantage, growth mindset, all these constructs that are out there, yet they're not reinforced within organizations. And you mentioned empathy a few times, obviously, given what's happening with COVID and remote work and working with home. So my question is this, is that when we have a behavioral framework, to what extent do we as organizational leaders and people analytics professionals need to have a data strategy in which to measure that framework? And some contend that if it's overly prescribed and overly measured, then it might not incent the right behaviors. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my view comes down to we've got to prove it. I often use the example of so if you're sitting in an exec meeting and then all of a sudden you get the sales report and sales are down for the month, what happens? We see that people will deploy target teams, everyone will get excited, they'll work day and night to ensure that they're delivering to that outcome. If you get in there and find that your people are disengaged, if you find some of the culture measures, you'll see people rationalize away the data. They'll say, oh, COVID or some other confounding factor is impacting it. So what we need to do, to your point, is we need to prove it. And for me, that goes beyond taking, and I'm never a fan of perfect silver bullets. I'm never a fan of that kind of guru thinking. My belief is every organization is unique. Every organization has a unique strategy. And what we should be doing is really looking at what are those factors that are going to drive that, and then building out a data framework. And the way to do that, in my opinion, is start with an outcome and then build it back until you find the impact of leadership, culture, employee experience, and all those factors.
Yeah, well, love it. And thank you for sharing like you do. And I really appreciate the metaphor as well. And I'll leave you with this. When you started, I spun up a poll. What do you like most on your avocados? And I had a few options. Salt and pepper ran away with it. But had I known, I would have put chocolate or fudge or something. That could have taken.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah,
well, again, thank you very much.
One thing today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks, Al.
Thank you. Be well, Nick.